And from the Negeb, he traveled on to a place in Egypt. That's in Genesis chapter 12. And I'll pick some selected scriptures from 10 to 20 in chapter 12. Now there was a famine in the land, so Abram went down to Egypt with his wife Sarai, who was a beautiful woman. And the Pharaoh treated Abram well for her sake. And Abram acquired sheep and cattle, male and female donkeys, manservants and maidservants, and camels. And there's more to the story, but this is the basic storyline, is that because Sarai was a very beautiful woman, he got some favoritism in that land, in the land of Egypt, from Pharaoh himself. So the way the story goes is this. Egyptians had laws prohibiting adultery. One man could not take another man's wife. Unfortunately, like many of our laws today, this one had a loophole that the Egyptians exploited, which was it was okay to kill the husband and take the widow. That was legal. So you can't commit adultery, but if you kill the husband, then it's okay to take his wife because the husband's dead after all. Well, that's a pretty big loophole, I would say. But it's one that was exploited. And Abram knew this going into Egypt. So he asked Sarai to tell the Egyptians that she was his sister and to be silent about the part that she was his wife. Because if she had said, "This is my husband Abram," they would have killed him and taken her as their wife. So because Sarai was really his half-sister, he was okay with this. And because of the situation, Pharaoh lavished Abraham with wealth and took Sarai into his palace. So this was, to his understanding, this was Abram's sister, so he was trying to give him all different kinds of wealth and possessions so that he could kind of legitimize saying, "Hey, I'd like to have Sarah come into my palace, and I'd like her, maybe to join his harem," or whatever he may have had at that time. Now, as the story continues, there was a sudden outbreak of a serious disease in Egypt, and the Egyptians suspected that it was a punishment by one of their gods for a violation of Egyptian law. So they began to investigate and find out, okay, what's going on here? Why is this plague suddenly come on us? Why are these diseases on us? They knew that something had been done wrong. And as the Egyptians investigated, they learned that Sarai was not only Abram's sister, but she was also his wife. Now the plot's been foiled. The real Pharaoh realizes he's done something that violated the law. And so what he did is he sent them away. He said, "Take all this wealth that I've given you, take all these possessions, and just get out of here." Because he didn't want the trouble that came with that breaking of the law. He wanted that trouble out of his country. So Pharaoh sent Abram's party away with not only possessions, but also servants that he had given him. So we're back on Abraham's journey. And now leaving Egypt, he returned to Shechem by way of the Negeb. So again, he crossed those desolate regions back into the territory of Canaan. And he came back to that place that he knew that was the very rich and fertile area called Shechem. In Genesis chapter 13, we'll read some selected verses in the range 1 to 11. This is from the New Revised Standard Version. So Abram went up to Egypt, to the Negeb, with his wife and everything he had, and Lot went with him. And from the Negeb, he went to from place to place, until he came to Bethel, to the place between Bethel and Ai, where his tent had been earlier, where he had first built an altar. And there Abram called on the name of the Lord. Once again, still learning about his God, who spoke to him. So as we look back on this map, we can see they started in Ur, the Chaldees, up to Haran, down to Shechem, and then across the Negeb and the desert into Egypt, and then back to Bethel, and finally to Shechem. So this is the journey that he's taken along this way. Now, all along this journey, God was making promises to him. It began when he was in Haran. He said, "I'll bless those that bless you, and I'll curse those that curse you. And that first promise was fulfilled in Egypt. God promised favor for his journey. And in Egypt, when all this fiasco happened with his sister/wife and the Pharaoh and that situation there, basically God turned that situation, which would have been dangerous for Abram. He was in danger of being killed, but God turned that whole situation around, and he used it to bring possessions to Abram. He gave him camels, different kinds of animals, servants, all different sorts of wealth. So during his travels, he accumulated this wealth, and this was the fulfillment of that first promise. It said, I will bless those who bless you. Now let's read on. Genesis chapter 13, again, verses 1 through 11, we'll read some more of that. Verse 5 says, Now Lot, who was moving around with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents. But the land could not support them while they stayed together, for their possessions were so great that they were not able to stay together. So Abram had accumulated so much wealth, and his nephew Lot had also accumulated a lot of wealth, and they had so much wealth, so many animals, so many tents, that there was actually some fighting between those servants as we read on. And it became necessary for them to part ways and to separate their company. So let's read on in verse 11. So Lot chose for himself the whole plain of the Jordan and set out toward the east. And the two men parted company. Through all this journey that they went, starting in Ur to Haran, all through the land of Canaan to Egypt and back, Lot was with him that whole time. And now these two men are parting. And at the moment that they part, as you read through the scriptures, right down, at the moment they parted, God fulfilled a second promise for Abram. Because Abram followed God, God was able to make another promise the first time Abram was in Shechem. He said, to your offspring I will give this land. So now Abram didn't stop there, he continued on his journey. And as a consequence of following God, God brought him back to this land of Shechem, this very rich and fertile land. And now that Lot has separated company, it was time for him to take a ceremonial possession of it. So again, we continue reading in chapter 13 of Genesis. And the Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, raise your eyes now and look to the place where you are, northward, southward, eastward, and westward. For all the land that you see will I give to you and to your offspring. No longer was it a promise just that Abraham's descendants would have this land, but now he said, I'm going to give you this land as well as your offspring. So this was actually yet another promise that God had made. This was in fact the third promise. The first promise was in Haran, blessings for the journey. The second promise was for the first time he was in Shechem. He said, I'll give this land to your descendants. Well, now Abram has returned. Because he followed God, he returned. And now God is making a third promise and kind of ceremonial, fulfilling the second one that he gave. He says, I'm going to give you this land. And so he continues and commands him, and he says, rise up, walk through the length and the breadth of the land, for I will give it to you. So if you were to read on to Abraham's continued journeys, he moved and pitched his tents in all different kind of areas in that land of Canaan. And it was as though everywhere his foot stepped, God was giving him that land. It's a theme that's recurred a few times in Scripture. But he sent him out all through the land, and he said, go and take possession of it. I mean, this is kind of akin to discoverers who, in the 14th century, came to the New World in the Western Hemisphere. And they would plant a flag for the king. Basically, wherever their feet stepped, they claimed that land for their country. And that's exactly what Abram was told to do, was to go walking through this land. And wherever he went, God was giving him that land. So this is the journey of Abram, and where God brought him. And again, as a consequence of his obedience, God was able to make additional promises to him.